The winter of 1884 had teeth, and it had already bitten clean through Elena Ashford's last shred of pride. She stood in the dim light before dawn, her reflection staring back from the cracked mirror in her rented room, a ghost of the woman she used to be. Her cheekbones pressed sharp against skin gone pale as old paper. The dress that had fit her perfectly 8 months ago now hung loose, the fabric bunching at her waist where hunger had carved away what grief hadn't already taken. Her hands trembled as she lifted the scissors, holding them open like a mouth ready to bite. The metal was cold against her palm, cold as the room, cold as the future stretching out before her with nothing in it but more emptiness. Her hair fell past her shoulders in waves the color of autumn chestnuts, thick and long, the one thing about her that still held value. Thomas had loved her hair. On their wedding day, he'd woven wildflowers through it and told her she looked like something out of a painting. That was before the mind took him, before the debts came crawling out like rats from the walls, before she learned that a dead husband's promises died with him. The landlord had given her until Saturday. 3 more days. She'd already sold the furniture, the dishes, her mother's silver locket. There was nothing left but this, the last piece of herself she could trade for survival. Elena wrapped the scissors and a torn piece of cloth around her hair, binding it tight. The baker, Mr. Hewitt, had a reputation for buying women's hair. He sold it to traders heading east, where fine ladies in Boston and New York paid good money for hairpieces and wigs. She'd heard he paid fair, though the transaction always happened quietly, before the sun came up, before decent people could see desperation changing hands for coins. She pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders and stepped out into the frozen street. Bitter Creek was still sleeping, the sky that bruised purple that came just before dawn. Her breath rose in thin clouds. She hadn't eaten in 3 days. The dizziness came in waves now, and she had to pause twice on the walk to the bakery, pressing her hand against the cold storefronts to keep from falling. The bakery smelled like salvation. Fresh bread, yeast, the warmth of ovens that had been burning since midnight. The scent hit her so hard she had to grip the doorframe, her stomach clenching with a hunger so fierce it felt like being stabbed from the inside. Mr. Hewitt looked up from behind the counter, his round face creasing with something that might have been pity or might have been the shrewd assessment of a man who knew how to profit from his fortune. Elena couldn't tell anymore. She couldn't tell much of anything except that she was so hungry she could barely think straight, and if she didn't eat soon, she wouldn't have the strength left to care whether she lived or died. "Mrs. Ashford," Hewitt said, wiping flour from his hands. Bit early for a visit. She untied the cloth from her hair, letting the weight of it fall free. The scissors were still in her other hand. "How much will you give me for it?" she whispered, her voice hollow with hunger and shame. She couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't bear to see whatever expression would cross his face when he understood what she was offering, what she'd been reduced to. Hewitt stepped closer, reaching out to touch her hair, testing the weight and texture like he was evaluating livestock. "It's good quality," he said slowly. "I could give you $2. Maybe 3 if I'm feeling generous. $3. Enough for a week's rent and a few days of food. Enough to buy her a little more time before she had to make the next impossible choice." Elena raised the scissors to her hair, her hands shaking so badly she could barely keep them steady. This was it. The last thing Thomas had loved about her, the last piece of vanity she'd clung to, about to fall to the floor in exchange for bread. She opened the blades, feeling the cold metal press against the base of her neck. One cut, that's all it would take. Just one cut, and she could eat today. She could survive another week. She could keep breathing, even if breathing had started to feel more like a punishment than a gift. Before the blades could close, a shadow fell across the doorway. Elena looked up, startled, and saw a man standing there with his hat in his hands, silhouetted against the growing dawn. He was tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the pale light behind him, and he stood perfectly still, staring at her with eyes that had seen too much suffering of their own. For a moment, nobody moved. The scissors stayed open against her hair. Hewitt's hand was still extended, waiting to receive what she was about to give. And the stranger just watched, his face carved into hard lines by weather and work and something deeper, something that looked like recognition. "Put those scissors down, ma'am," the man said quietly. His voice was rough and used to speaking, but there was something in it that made Elena's hands freeze. Not a command exactly, more like a plea dressed up as one. He stepped into the bakery, and she could see him better now. Maybe 34 or 35, with dark hair threaded with early gray and a scar along his jaw that spoke of old violets. He wore work clothes, a rancher's gear, everything about him suggesting a man who spent his days alone with animals and sky. "You'll never go hungry again," he said, and the words hung in the air between them like a promise or a prophecy or maybe both. Elena stared at him, confusion and suspicion warring with a desperate hope that flared in her chest before she could stomp it out. She lowered the scissors slowly, her arm aching with the effort. "I don't know you," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she meant it to, like a child's voice, lost and afraid. The man nodded. "Name's Daniel Mercer." "Dan, I got a ranch outside town, about an hour's ride west. I need help. Housekeeper, cook, someone to manage the house while I work the land. It's honest work, fair wage, room and board included. You'd have your own space, your privacy. All I'm asking is that you keep the place running through winter." Hewitt snorted. "That ain't proper, Mercer. Widow woman living alone with a bachelor? Folks'll talk." Dan's eyes didn't leave Elena's face. "Folks talk anyway. Doesn't change the fact that Mrs. Ashford here needs work and I need help." He paused, then added quietly, "I'll take the barn loft. She'll have the cabin. Separate quarters. Everything respectable." Elena's mind raced. This was insane. She didn't know this man. Didn't know what he really wanted, what price he'd expect her to pay beyond whatever work he claimed to need. But the scissors were still in her hand, and her hair was still attached to her head, and the smell of bread was making her so dizzy she thought she might faint right there on the bakery floor. "I don't accept charity, sir," she said, trying to hold on to some shred of dignity, even as she felt it slipping through her fingers like water. Dan shook his head. "It ain't charity. It's work. Hard work, too. Cooking, cleaning, mending. Winter's hard out there. I'm not asking you to take my help for free. I'm asking you to earn your keep, same as anyone would." He pulled a few coins from his pocket and set them on the counter, paying for the supplies he'd come to buy. Then he looked at her again, and this time she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not pity, something else. Understanding, maybe. The look of someone who'd stood exactly where she was standing and knew what it cost to accept help when you'd rather die than admit you needed it. "You stay till spring thaw," he said. 3 months. If it doesn't suit, you're free to leave soon as the road's clear. But you keep your hair, and you eat regular, and you don't have to sell pieces of yourself to survive." Elena looked down at the scissors still clutched in her hand, then at Hewitt, who was watching this whole exchange with narrow eyes, already composing the story he'd tell his wife, the gossip that would spread through Bitter Creek like wildfire. Then back at the stranger, this Dan Mercer, who was offering her something she didn't quite believe in anymore. A way out, a chance, 3 months of not starving, 3 months to figure out what came next. "I'll work hard, Mr. Mercer," she heard herself say, and the words felt like surrender and salvation all tangled together. "You won't regret this." His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened just slightly. "I already don't, ma'am." He bought a loaf of bread from Hewitt, who handed it over with a disapproving grunt and passed it to Elena. "For the road," he said simply. She took it with shaking hands, too overwhelmed to speak, too hungry to refuse. The bread was still warm. She could feel the heat of it through the cloth wrapping, could smell the yeast and wheat, and it took every ounce of willpower not to tear into it right there like an animal. They left the bakery together, as the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting Bitter Creek in shades of gold and shadow. Behind them, Elena could feel Hewitt's eyes on her back, could already hear the whispers that would start before breakfast. The widow Ashford, moving in with that strange Mercer fellow, living in sin, disgraceful. Poor Thomas must be spinning in his grave. But for the first time in 8 months, Elena had bread in her hands and the promise of more to come. As Dan helped her up into his wagon, his touch careful and brief, she allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe the worst was behind her. She didn't know yet about the secret growing inside her. Didn't know that Dan's cabin held ghosts of its own. Didn't know that 3 months could change everything, could break you and remake you into someone you never imagined becoming. All she knew was that she was leaving Bitter Creek with her hair still on her head and a stranger's promise ringing in her ears. You'll never go hungry again. And as the wagon rolled west toward the mountains, Elena closed her eyes and let herself hope. The ranch sat in a valley 5 miles from town, sheltered by pines that whispered secrets to the wind. Elena's first sight of it caught her breath. Not grand, but solid. A 2-story house with a wraparound porch, barn and stable, corrals stretching toward the hills. It looked like a place waiting for life to return. Dan carried her single bag inside. Your room's upstairs, first door. I'm down the hall. He gestured awkwardly. Bathrooms between. I made sure everything was ready. The room stunned her. Clean sheets, a quilt in wedding ring pattern, fresh curtains. A vase of dried wildflowers on the dresser. He'd prepared for her. Planned this. It's perfect, she whispered. That first dinner was torture. They sat at opposite ends of a table built for 6, forks scraping plates in silence. Elena's stew was passable but oversalted from nerves. Dan ate every bite without complaint. Routines formed quickly. He rose before dawn, worked until dark, mending fences, tending cattle, fixing whatever the harsh winter had broken. She cleaned, cooked, discovered he'd let the house go to seed since his wife died. Every corner she touched came back to life. Small gestures appeared. Firewood stacked by her door each morning, though she never asked. Her torn cloak mended, the stitches awkward but serviceable. Once, she found wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table. When she thanked him, he grunted and fled outside, neck red. 2 weeks in, she finally cooked something perfect. Roast chicken with herbs from the struggling garden she discovered. Dan took a second helping, then a third. When he pushed back from the table, he almost smiled. That's the best meal I've had in 3 years. It's just chicken. No, ma'am, it ain't. That evening, they sat by the fire for the first time without immediately retreating to separate corners. Elena mended socks. Dan oiled his saddle. The silence felt comfortable instead of strained. Why did you help me? The question escaped before she could stop it. In the bakery, you didn't know me. His hands stilled on the leather. Someone helped me once. When Sarah died, He stopped, jaw tight. A stranger gave me work when I couldn't see straight for grief. Kept me alive when I didn't want to be. His eyes met hers, dark with old pain. Recognize that look in your eyes. The one that says you're drowning and too proud to scream. Her throat closed. He understood. This hard, quiet man understood. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded and returned to his work. They sat in silence until the fire burned low, but something had shifted. Some wall between them had developed a crack. The trip to town came 3 weeks after her arrival. They needed supplies, and Elena needed fabric for new curtains. The wagon ride started pleasant enough. Spring was fighting winter, and the air smelled of wet earth and possibility. But Bitter Creek had not forgotten the widow, Ashford, leaving town with a bachelor. Women turned away when Elena approached. Conversations died. The general store went silent when they entered together. Elena felt every eye like a brand. On the boardwalk, Kathleen Brennan blocked their path. Gray-haired, iron-spined, the town's self-appointed moral guardian. Mrs. Ashford. She looked at Dan with contempt. Or do you use another name now? Living in sin with this man, disgracing your husband's memory. That's enough. Dan's voice cut like steel. He stepped between them, his size suddenly menacing. Mrs. Ashford is my employee. Anyone suggesting otherwise answers to me. We clear. Mrs. Brennan's face purpled, but she stepped aside. The wagon ride home was silent. Elena stared at her hands, humiliated, wanting to disappear, wanting to run. I should leave, she finally said. This will only get worse. No, Dan. I don't give a damn about reputation. He kept his eyes on the road. You're safe. You're fed. You're staying. Her eyes burned. No one had defended her like that. Ever. Something in her chest cracked open, and she almost cried, not from shame, but from something far more dangerous. She was beginning to feel things she had no right to feel. A month at the ranch, and the routines felt like they'd existed forever. Elena knew the rhythm of Dan's footsteps on the stairs, the way he took his coffee black and scalding, how he checked the sky each morning like it held answers. And he knew her, knew she hummed while kneading bread, that she read by lamplight until her eyes drooped, that thunderstorms made her jumpy though she tried to hide it. The thought came unexpectedly. Elena was hanging laundry when she heard cursing from the corral. She looked over to see Dan wrestling with the most stubborn horse she'd ever witnessed, a paint mare who seemed determined to buck him into next week. He landed hard in the mud for the third time, and something about his expression, his dignity completely abandoned, struck her as absurdly funny. She laughed, actually laughed, the sound rusty from disuse, but real. Dan looked up, muddy and startled, and then his face transformed. He smiled, a genuine, wide smile that made him look years younger and dangerously handsome. Her heart stuttered in her chest. That evening by the fire, the easy silence had become something else, something charged. Elena found herself watching his hands as he whittled, the sure movements, the strength in them. When he caught her looking, she blushed and focused hard on her sewing. "Can I ask you something?" she ventured. "About your marriage." His knife stilled. She thought he'd refuse, but he set the wood aside. "What do you want to know? Were you happy?" "I was content. Sarah was good and kind. We were comfortable together." He stared into the flames. "But it wasn't." He stopped, searching for words. "Thomas, were you happy with him?" Elena considered lying, then didn't. "It was arranged. Our families thought we suited. He was decent, worked hard, never raised his voice. But passionate? No. I cared for him, mourned him, but..." She twisted her wedding ring, Thomas's ring, still on her finger. "I feel guilty for not grieving harder, for feeling relief sometimes because the marriage was just adequate." "I understand that," Dan said quietly. "Had a wife before Sarah. Ellen. She died in childbirth, baby 2, 3 years back. I made her promises I couldn't keep. Promised she'd be safe, that everything would be fine. Watch her slip away and couldn't do nothing." His voice roughened. "Now I make promises I can keep. Simple ones. Food, shelter, safety." The weight of his loss pressed into the room. Elena wanted to reach for him, comfort him, but didn't dare. Instead, she said softly, "You kept your promise to me." His eyes found hers across the firelight, and something unspoken passed between them. Awareness. Want. The air felt too thick to breathe. Elena's skin flushed, hyper-conscious of every detail. The deep timbre of his voice, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, how his gaze seemed to see straight through her carefully maintained walls. The ice storm hit on a Tuesday. Elena stepped onto the porch with a basket of scraps for the chickens, and her feet went out from under her. She didn't even have time to scream before strong arms caught her, pulled her against a solid chest. Dan held her, and neither moved. She could feel his heartbeat, rapid against her back. His breath stirred her hair. His arms stayed locked around her waist, and she didn't want him to let go. Ever. "You all right?" His voice was rough, close to her ear. She couldn't speak, just nodded. He released her slowly, steadying her, his hands lingering at her waist. When she turned, His face was inches from hers. She saw hunger there, quickly shuddered. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." "It's Dan, ma'am. Just Dan." That night, Elena lay awake in her narrow bed, her body still remembering the feel of his arms. Down the hall, Dan stared at his ceiling, thinking of her softness, her laugh, the way she'd fit against him so perfectly. Both of them wanted. Neither dared speak it, but Elena had a secret growing inside her, one she'd been denying for weeks. The dizziness, the nausea, the exhaustion, she'd blamed work, blamed recovery from near starvation. But her courses hadn't come, not since before Thomas died. And this morning, she'd fainted while cooking breakfast. Dan had been outside. She caught herself on the counter, terrified. She couldn't hide it much longer. And when Dan found out she carried Thomas's child, everything would change. The collapse came on a Thursday morning. Elena was frying eggs when the room tilted sideways. She grabbed for the counter, missed, and felt the floor rush up to meet her. When she woke, she was in her bed with Dan hovering over her, his face pale with terror. "Don't move. Doc Morrison's coming." "Elena, don't." His voice cracked, and she saw the raw fear in his eyes. He'd lost 2 women to childbirth. He thought he was losing her too. Dr. Morrison arrived within the hour, examined her while Dan paced the hallway like a caged animal. When the doctor emerged, his expression was bemused. "She's perfectly healthy, Dan. Just pregnant. About 3 months along, I'd say. She needs rest and regular meals, but there's no danger." Elena heard Dan's sharp inhale through the door, then silence. Heavy, terrible silence. When the doctor left, Dan came in slowly. He sat in the chair by her bed, hands clasped so tight his knuckles were white. Elena felt shame burn through her, hot and acidic. "I didn't know," she whispered. I suspected, but I wasn't certain until I should have told you sooner. I understand if you want me to leave. This wasn't part of our arrangement." "No." His voice was flat, decided. "You'll marry me." She stared at him. "What?" "You'll marry me," he repeated, meeting her eyes. "Child needs a name. You need protection. It's the right thing to do. The right thing. Duty. Obligation." Elena felt something shrivel inside her chest. "I won't trap you in a marriage because I'm carrying another man's child. You don't owe me that. Ain't about owing. It's about what's right." He stood, moved to the window, his back rigid. "You can't raise a child alone, not in this town. They'll make your life hell. Baby too. This solves it. You don't love me." The words came out small, broken. She'd been falling for him, helplessly, hopelessly, and he was offering her a business arrangement. A transaction. He turned then, something flashing in his eyes. Pain, anger, want, quickly buried. "Love's got nothing to do with survival, Elena. I can give you safety, give the child a home. That's more than most marriages have." She wanted to scream at him, shake him, demand to know if he felt anything for her beyond pity. But pride locked her throat. "A marriage in name only," she said stiffly. "Separate rooms. I won't burden you with expectations of anything more." Something in his face went carefully blank. "If that's what you want." "It is." "Liar," her heart whispered. "Coward." "Fine. We'll go to town Friday. Get done." He walked to the door, paused with his hand on the frame. "For what it's worth, I don't consider a burden. Never have." Then he was gone, and Elena pressed her face into the pillow, refusing to cry. Friday came cold and clear. They rode to town in silence, dressed in their Sunday best. The justice of the peace married them in his parlor with his wife as witness. Dan's hand shook when he slid the ring onto her finger, a simple gold band, worn smooth. "It was my father's," he said quietly. "Gave it to Ellen, then Sarah. Now you." It seemed more grief than joy, but maybe you can change that. The kiss was brief, chaste, his lips barely brushing hers. But Elena felt it everywhere, a shock that traveled to her toes. When she opened her eyes, his were dark and hungry before he looked away. Mrs. Brennan watched from across the street as they left, her expression scandalized. "Let her talk." Elena was a married woman now, respectable, safe. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like loss. That night, they returned to their separate rooms. Nothing changed except everything. Elena was Mrs. Mercer now, but Dan wouldn't look at her growing belly, wouldn't meet her eyes for longer than necessary. They moved around each other like strangers, careful, polite, miserable, both lying awake in the dark, both regretting the walls they'd built, neither brave enough to tear them down. The distance grew despite the ring on her finger, despite the vows they'd spoken. Something had to break, or they'd shatter, trying to hold the pieces together. The blizzard hit without warning on a March evening, the kind of storm old-timers said came once in a generation. Dan had been checking the livestock when the sky turned from gray to black in minutes. Elena watched from the window as snow swallowed the world, thick and blinding. An hour passed. Then two. The wind howled like something dying, and Dan didn't come back. Fear clawed up her throat. She pulled on Thomas's old coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and stepped into the maelstrom. The cold hit like a fist, stealing her breath. She couldn't see 3 feet ahead, but she pushed toward the barn, one hand on her belly, the other reaching blindly. She found him collapsed in the snow near the barn door, lips blue, ice crusted in his hair and beard. Dan, Dan, please. She shook him and got a weak groan. Somehow, fueled by terror and love, she dragged him inside. He was twice her size, and she was 6 months pregnant, but adrenaline made her strong. She got him to the fireplace, stripped his frozen clothes with shaking hands, piled every blanket she owned over him, and fed the fire until it roared. Then she lay beside him, pressing her warmth into his ice-cold body, rubbing his arms and chest, willing life back into him. His skin was like marble. She worked for hours, never stopping, talking to him constantly. "Don't you dare leave me, Dan Mercer. Don't you dare. I won't let you. Do you hear me? I won't." The baby kicked against her ribs, as if agreeing. Around midnight, his shivering started, violent, uncontrollable, but it meant his body was fighting. She held him through it, whispering prayers and promises and pleas. The fever came with dawn. His temperature spiked, and he started mumbling, thrashing against the blankets. Elena bathed his face with cool water, trying to bring the fever down, but his words broke her heart. "Sarah, I'm sorry. Tried to save you. Couldn't save the baby. My fault, all my fault." He wept without waking, and Elena wept with him, understanding finally the full weight of his grief. But then his hand found hers, gripped it desperately. "Elena," he breathed, still lost in delirium. "Don't leave. Can't lose you too. Can't. Love you, always loved you. From that first morning, scissors in your hand and fire in your eyes. Loved you." His voice broke. "Don't take her from me. Please, God, don't take her." Elena froze, her heart stopping, then restarting at triple speed. He loved her. He'd always loved her. All those careful distances, those walls, he'd built them to protect himself from losing someone else, not because he didn't care. She pressed his hand to her wet cheek and stayed beside him through the long night, tending him, praying, finally admitting to herself what she'd known for months. She loved this stubborn, broken, beautiful man with everything she had. By morning, the fever broke. He woke slowly, disoriented, and found her curled in the chair beside him, exhausted but watchful. Memory returned in pieces, the cold, the storm, her hands on him. Then his eyes went wide with horror. "You came out in that? Are you insane? You're pregnant, Elena. You could have died. The baby." He tried to sit up, swayed dangerously. "So could you." She was on her feet, months of restraint shattering. "You could have died, and I would have found you frozen in the snow. And what was I supposed to do then? You're my husband. In name only. That was your condition. Maybe I don't want it to be in name only anymore." The words tore out of her, raw and true. Silence crashed between them. Elena's chest heaved, her face flushed, and Dan stared at her like she'd grown wings. She couldn't stop now. I heard you. Last night. What you said. His face went white. Elena, you said you loved me. That you'd always loved me. Her voice shook. Did you mean it? Or was it just fever talking? He closed his eyes, jaw clenched like he was in pain. When he opened them, there was no shield left, no walls, just naked honesty. I meant every word, he said hoarsely. Every damn word. I've loved you since that morning in the bakery, when you looked at me like I was crazy for offering help. Fell harder every day after. Kept my distance because you deserved better than a broken man with ghosts in his house. Thought if I stayed away from you, you'd be safe from me wanting things I got no right to want. His voice dropped to a ragged whisper. But I want them anyway. Want you. Always have. The truth hung between them, fragile and terrifying and real. No more hiding. No more lies. Elena took a shaking breath and stepped toward him, toward everything she'd been too afraid to reach for. Then stop staying away, she whispered. I want you too. Dan sat heavily on the edge of the bed, looking at her like she was something precious he was afraid to break. You don't know what you're saying. You've been through hell, nearly lost me, you're exhausted. I know exactly what I'm saying. Elena moved closer, her hand finding his face, tracing the line of his jaw. I'm saying I love you, Dan Mercer. I've loved you for months, been terrified to admit it, because you married me out of duty and I thought I'd be trapping you twice over. Once with vows, once with feelings you didn't want. Her voice broke. But if there's even a chance you meant what you said, if you really love me, then I'm done pretending. I'm done sleeping alone in a cold bed wishing you were there. I'm done with this half-life we've been living. His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his cheek. I meant it. God help me. I meant every word. You walk into a room and the air changes. You smile and something in my chest cracks open. I watch you at the stove, in the garden, reading by the fire, and think, this is what a home feels like. This is what I was missing. He stood, towering over her, his hands framing her face with devastating gentleness. But Elena, I'm scared. Terrified. I couldn't save Sarah or Ellen. What if something happens to you? What if the baby, his voice fractured? Nothing's going to happen. She pressed her palm against his chest, felt his heart hammering. Dr. Morrison says I'm healthy. The baby's strong. I'm not them, Dan. I'm not your ghosts. I'm right here, right now, and I'm choosing you. Choose me back. He stared at her for one suspended moment. Then his control shattered. He kissed her like a drowning man, finding air, desperate, hungry, reverent. His arms wrapped around her carefully, mindful of her belly, and she melted into him. Finally home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, his eyes were wet. This baby, he said, his hand hovering over her swollen stomach. Thomas's child. Am I allowed to? This is your child now, Elena said fiercely. Ours, if you'll have us. Both of us. She placed his hand on her belly, and the baby kicked as if in agreement. Dan's face transformed, wonder, terror, joy all at once. A sound came from his throat, half laugh, half sob. I'll have you both, he whispered. God help me. I'll have you both and do everything in my power to keep you safe. Then take me to bed. Husband, Elena said softly. Our bed. And make this marriage real. He searched her face one more time, found only certainty, and lifted her into his arms. He carried her down the hall to his room, their room now, and laid her down like she was made of glass. What happened next was tender and clumsy and perfect. Two people learning each other after months of longing, shedding the last barriers between them. He touched her like she was a miracle, kissed every part of her he could reach, whispered her name like a prayer. And when they finally joined, it felt like coming home, like two broken pieces finally fitting together into something whole. Afterward, they lay tangled together, her head on his chest, his hand stroking her hair, both of them stunned by the completeness of it. You'll never go hungry again, he murmured into her hair, echoing the promise that had started everything. Elena pressed a kiss over his heart. And you'll never be alone again. Winter broke after that, giving way to spring with almost violent speed. The frozen world thawed, and so did the house. It came alive in ways it never had before, Elena's laughter ringing through the rooms. Dan's smile no longer rare, their touches constant and casual and claiming. He couldn't pass her without trailing his fingers along her shoulder, her waist, the curve of her neck. She found excuses to be near him, brushing against him while he washed at the pump, sitting close while they ate, falling asleep wrapped in his arms every night. The house filled with small joys, wildflowers in jars, books shared by lamplight, his hand on her belly feeling the baby move, stolen kisses in doorways. The trip to town in April was different from that first humiliating visit. They rode together, Dan's arm around her, her head on his shoulder, both of them unable to stop touching even in public. At the general store, Mrs. Brennan watched them with pursed lips, but this time Elena saw something else in the older woman's face. Grudging approval, maybe even envy. They were so clearly in love it radiated from them like heat. Dan kept one hand possessively at the small of Elena's back while selecting supplies, and when she admired a bolt of blue fabric, he bought it without asking the price. At the ribbon counter, he paused, picked up a card of blue silk ribbons the exact color of her eyes. "These," he said, handing them to her. "Keep your hair long. I love it." Elena flushed with pleasure. "It's vain. It's beautiful. You're beautiful." He said it loud enough that half the store heard, and didn't care who knew it. On the ride home, Elena fingered the ribbons and thought about that morning months ago when she'd been ready to cut her hair and sell for bread. If someone had told her then that she'd end up here, loved, safe, happy, she would have thought them mad. Dan seemed to read her mind. "What are you thinking? That I'm glad you walked into that bakery." His hand tightened on the reins. "Best decision I ever made." Spring deepened into early summer. Elena's belly grew large and round, and Dan became increasingly protective, barely letting her lift anything heavier than a teacup. She complained about being coddled, but secretly loved it. Loved the way he'd jump up to help her rise from chairs, the way he'd rub her aching back without being asked, how he'd talk to the baby while his head rested against her stomach. "You be good to your mama," he'd murmur. "Come on out when you're ready, but be gentle about it. She's tougher than she looks, but I'm not taking chances." The labor started on a June morning, 3 weeks before Dr. Morrison predicted. Elena's water broke while she was kneading bread, and Dan went white as snow. "It's too early. Something's wrong. I'll get the doctor, Dan." She gripped his hand. "It's fine. Babies come when they're ready. Go get Dr. Morrison, but don't panic." He kissed her hard and rode like hell for town. The doctor arrived in time, calm and competent, and Elena labored through the afternoon while Dan paced holes in the porch, terrified and useless. When the baby's first cry pierced the air, he burst through the door, needing to see with his own eyes that Elena was alive. She was propped up in bed, exhausted and glowing, holding a small bundle. "Dan," she said, smiling, "come meet your daughter." His legs nearly gave out. He crossed to the bed slowly, staring at the tiny red face peeking from the blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and Elena's delicate features and lungs like a blacksmith's bellows. She was perfect, healthy, alive. He sat carefully on the bed's edge, and Elena placed the baby in his arms. The weight of her, the warm, solid reality, broke something inside him, some last frozen piece of grief. He wept openly, holding this child who wasn't his by blood, but was his in every way that mattered. "She's perfect," he managed. "Elena, she's perfect. What should we name her?" Elena asked softly. Dan looked at his wife, at the baby in his arms, at the life they'd built from desperation and loneliness and unexpected love. "Emily," he said. "We'll call her Emily." That evening, Dan sat on the porch with his family, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. Elena rocked beside him with Emily nursing contentedly, and he thought about that morning in the bakery, how he'd seen a desperate woman with scissors raised to her hair, and something in him had broken open. He'd made an impulsive promise. You'll never go hungry again. It was the best decision he'd ever made. Elena had filled his house with warmth, his bed with passion, his heart with purpose. She'd given him a daughter and a future and taught him that love wasn't something to fear, but something to fight for. Elena looked over at him, reading his expression with the ease of long intimacy. What are you thinking? That I'm the luckiest man alive. She smiled, tired and radiant. We both are. Lucky, I mean. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged. A family forged not from ease but from hardship, not from convention but from choice. In Bitter Creek, they told the story for generations. The day a desperate widow raised scissors to her hair and a quiet cowboy spoke 5 words that changed 2 lives forever. You'll never go hungry again. And she never did. She found instead something far more nourishing than bread. A man who fed her heart, a love that sustained her soul, and a home where hunger of any kind had no place. The cowboy found his own salvation in keeping his promise, learned that some vows bind not with obligation, but with joy, and discovered that the best way to heal a broken heart is to give it away completely. Their story became legend, whispered proof that sometimes the most desperate moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings, and that love, when it finally arrives, is always worth the wait.